My name is Stanley Miller, and I was born in St. Paul, Minnesota, in January 9th, 1922.
One of the questions we ask people right to begin with is, where were you on December 7th, 1941?
Well, I was home, and I remember the first announcement came over the radio as a special, and I forget what program we were listening to, but at home in the evening, and of course everybody was surprised, and we knew that people in my age group had to do something. So I ended up enlisting in the Army Air Corps, the Aviation Cadet Program, because I did not want to be drafted and end up in a foxhole someplace. I was successful. I ended up graduating from flying school, and after a couple of stateside assignments, ended up in the 4th Combat Cargo Group, flying C-46 Curtiss Commandos, and we deployed to China, Burma, India. And there we did two things. We supplied the British Army in Burma and also flew the hump, supplying the forces in Western China from Northeast India and Burma.
How many missions did you fly?
Well, we didn't go by missions. We went by hours flown. And it was hard to figure a mission, especially when we're supporting the British in Burma, because some were short, some were long, and things. So, but I ended up with close to 900 what they called combat hours, flying in combat areas during the time I was over there.
What was kind of the average distance that you flew? Or was there no
Well, we didn't go by distance. We went by hours in the air, of course. And in Burma, of course, it depended. We were stationed at Chittagong, India most of the time, and when the Japanese were in northern Burma, the flights weren't so long, but when they got down towards Rangoon, then we had much longer flights and would only do one a day, but we were doing 2 and 3 a day early on. And on the hump, hour from where we were stationed, we had about a 3.5 hour flight one way over the hump. And of course that would vary somewhat depending on winds and weather and things.
How many people were on a plane?
Well, our crew was 4. We had the 2 pilots, a flight engineer, and a signals man, a radio operator. And he could usually tune in Tokyo Rose for us, so we got American music.
Did you stick with the same crew most of the time?
Yes, the crews were assigned, and we didn't always fly the same airplane, but we did have basically the same crews.
That had to be a good close association.
Yeah, that's right. Well, then it depended. The people that were, I joined the unit when it was forming, and we did all our training together in the States. So, and then after we built up time, we became the instructors. So we got new people in. We would check them out as the pilots and things. So as the war progressed, we didn't always fly with our same crew. We had these other people that had familiarized with the routes and things.
How many planes were in your squadron and in your unit?
Well, the squadron had 25 airplanes, and there were 4 squadrons in the group, so we had 100 total of 100 C-46s, and daily we would probably have about 80% of them flying. And when we were, especially when we were supplying the Japanese in the big push, we were running 3 missions a day sometimes, and they would reload the airplane. You know, you run your 3, and then they reload the airplane, and another crew would take it up. So if it was still didn't need any maintenance, so they kept going. We logged a lot of flying time.
Was it difficult to take off with a group and keep it together in some of the weather conditions?
Can you repeat that, please?
Did you fly with several other planes, and how did you keep everybody together if you did?
No, we were individual mission. We have a lot of planes going to the same place, but you went individually, and you didn't try to fly together or anything. That would make early on, when there were still a few Japanese airplanes in Burma, it would have made a better target anyway. And if they reported enemy planes in the air, we always got right down on the deck, because then your shadow, they couldn't track you from your shadow so much on the top of the jungles.
You were talking about that you did a few airdrops in certain circumstances. Kind of describe what happened there, and did you have any contact with anybody on the ground before you get into those situations?
Well, as far as contact with the people on the ground, occasionally, but not always. And we'd know how much rain there was, and if these dirt fields were too muddy, then they'd plan the airdrop based on information that the home base had. And so then we'd circle around, have a drop zone. And that was kind of interesting too, because the Japanese that were close by in the jungle, they wouldn't shoot at us, even though we were flying low to kick out the cargo, until they knew we made our last pass. Usually it took about 3 passes to get rid of the cargo. And then you could pick up some small ground fire. And after the drop was completed with the however number of airplanes we had in it, then there'd be a little war to see who got the supplies, whether the Japanese managed to get them or the British got them. So it was one of those things. And we hauled everything it took to fight the war, and we'd haul wounded back to India on a return trip frequently. So it made an interesting mission, and I'm sure we contributed something to the defeat of the Japanese at that time.
One thing that a lot of people have no idea is that you went out unescorted and without any armament.
That's correct. Well, early on, the Japanese did have some fighters in Burma, but Japan was being pressed so hard in the Pacific that they withdrew their support for their forces in Burma. So they didn't have fuel, didn't have parts for their airplanes, so that helped us a lot. They couldn't get a lot of defensive activity up.
At what stage of the war was this? About what, 1944, 45?
1944 and 45, yes.
What kind of fields did you have to take off and land from?
Fields? Well, at the main bases, like Chittagong, India, and when we were flying the Hump, we had 5,000 or 6,000 foot paved runways. Of course, when we were supplying the British in Burma, they would just scrape off the ground, and we'd have maybe 3,000 feet to take the loaded C-46 into. And we had one mission where there was no airport at all. We had to haul some Swedish Bofors guns and crews to a place in eastern Burma where the Japanese were about to overrun the friendly forces. And they just cut out some shrubbery and marked flags at the end of the runway. So kind of like barnstorming after World War I, except that we were flying at that, when we landed there, probably a 48,000 pound airplane with the C-46. So we had some interesting missions. And occasionally we did airdrops when the weather was bad and things were muddy and things you couldn't get in.
Flying it into Burma, especially into the later, you mentioned they were kind of more makeshift fields and kind of cut out of the jungle and shorter runways. Were C-46s designed to land in conditions like that, and were they designed to take off and land at short fields?
Well, the 46 had two good things about it. A very rugged airplane. The landing gear was very, very rugged. And also good engines. The R-2800 was very good. We had a 2,000 horsepower version with a two-stage supercharger for higher altitude flying. So it was a good engine. And of course, when we left, landing isn't as bad as taking off. And when we offloaded and were empty, basically going back, we could get off 3,000 foot strip without any problem at all. You wanted to hit the end of the runway landing a lot of times, but so you could stop in time. And on the dirt strips, actually, I think the brakes were more effective than they would have been on an asphalt strip. You wouldn't slide as much. You pick up some dirt, but you don't slide as much. So we didn't, I don't know if we had any of our planes that ran off into the jungles or not. But I remember we had one mission. We were moving British forces from India down into Burma, And the British loaded the airplanes for us with their tents and all their equipment and personnel. Came up to the plane, and here they had this big fuselage, and it was pretty well 2/3 full. And I said, has this been weighed? And they said, no, but there's a lot of bloody room left. And but on that takeoff, I remember it was a 6,000-foot runway, and at the end of the runway, we just pulled up the gear and started saying, "Our Father who art in heaven," because the airplane really was not quite ready to fly yet. And I don't know how much weight we had. There's no way of telling. But really, if we would have lost an engine, we would have been right in the jungle. There's no question about it. And so, you had some interesting experiences. Nail biting.
You mentioned being around the British. Did the British fly in and out of there? Did they have any differences with their planes and the way they flew?
Well, there were 2 Australian squadrons, and we had some RAF airplanes too. Now they flew the C-47 that they called Dakota, was their terminology for it. So they didn't carry as much cargo as we did. And the Australians were great people. They were really great to work with. But I think we fought a little more with the British than we did with the Japanese sometimes. And I remember once one of the loads, not my airplane, one of the other airplanes hauled a couple cases of whiskey with Scotch, for the British officers wherever this load was going. And in the C-46, you had the belly compartments, and they were split into 2 parts. The front part, there was a trap door behind the pilot's seat where you went down, and some of the equipment was there. Then there was a door out other side of the wing that you could load or unload with. And so the crew of this plane, they took a case of the whiskey and dropped it down and out into a Jeep and took it up. And then they wouldn't sign the manifest for the load because they said, there's a case of whiskey missing. And gee, the British major, loadmaster, all these people came down, and finally nothing happened. Now, they knew what happened, but there was no way they could prove it. And our group commander got upset a little bit, but that was okay. Not too upset. And so those things happened. And on the hump, though, of course, the fields in China all did have paved runways. And our biggest problem flying the hump were the weather and the lack of adequate navigation facilities, because the winds were never forecast right. And that part of the world is odd in that there are 3 weather systems that keep merging over the Himalayan mountains. So you get a cold, dry one from the north and a wet one from the south, and the general moderate air mass from the west, and the mixture. And that's what created many thunderstorms and things over there. So we had a lot of weather flying, a lot of rough times.
Being in India and then Burma, had to be very hot, and then going over the hump, we've heard stories from the other pilots about how cold it got flying over the Himalayas there.
Well, yes. Of course, the temperature drops off approximately 3 degrees Fahrenheit every 1,000 feet you go up. So if you're flying at 20,000 feet, it'll be 60 degrees cooler than it would be at sea level, on the ground. So, but the heating system in the cockpit was good in the airplane. That wasn't the problem. The problem was if you had to jump out, and then you get into some adverse weather and temperatures and things. Most of our loads over the hump were 55-gallon drums of gas, and we'd carry 31 of them in a C-46 to support what had been the Flying Tigers, then was the 14th Air Force and the other air activity over there. And but talking about the weather, I came back one day and landed, and I had just 7 gallons of gas in one wing and 8 gallons of gas in the other wing, because we had headwinds that were stronger than forecast. And so, but what they did in China, the C-46, they would also drain what out of our tanks if we're one of the bases closer to India, and the amount of gas they thought we didn't need. So after that experience, we had one of us sat on the wing with our .45 automatic handy, and they only took as much gas as we wanted them to take. So, because we did have one or two airplanes that ran out of gas before they got back to the home base. So these were the type of things you had to put up with, plus a lot of rough flying. And I remember once, this is kind of hard to explain maybe to people who aren't familiar with it, but the navigation facilities basically were what they called non-directional homers. There was a radio signal put out 360 degrees around the antenna. And in the airplane, you had your radio compass, instrument on the panel that gave you the heading you were flying, and a needle that pointed to the station that you had tuned in. So as long as you kept those straight, you would hopefully get to the right place. Well, in thunderstorms, there's an awful lot of electrical energy. And we came back once in weather all the way, and about a few minutes before our estimated time of arrival was up, the needle swung, meaning that we had passed the station. So we took our turn to the south to start our letdown and called the base, and they came back and said, I don't know what you want to make a letdown for, it's perfectly clear here. But there was enough electrical energy in that storm that it held the needle for almost a minute. But then I cranked back to the westerly heading, and sure enough, we broke out pretty quick, and beautiful weather down on the ground. Also, when we moved Chinese troops as the war was ending from eastern Burma back to South China, and there were some interesting missions there, because first of all, we took their guns away from them and put them in the belly compartment. And we didn't, they just walked on as many as we could get on the airplane. There were no seats or seat belts for them or anything. And they used to then wander back and forth, and then of course that affects your trim of the airplane. So then we'd go up, and the southern route there, you could actually on a clear day, you could pick your way through at 10 or 11,000 feet, but we'd go up to about 15, 16,000, and where we had our oxygen up front, and then they'd all go to sleep in the back because the air was thinner and they didn't move around so much.
Well, that had to be some kind of an experience spending all that time, just flying that much. You didn't have much time off, did you?
No, not a lot of time off. No, and well, I did have an occasional day off, only in the middle of the afternoon, my flight leader came by and said, oh, there you are, Stan, come on, we've got a special mission into Burma, and gonna rush whatever the equipment was down to some forward base. And I said, it's my day off. And he said, it was your day off. And so the plane was loaded, and we got in it. Between India and Burma, there was a range of mountains that ran up to 6 to 7,500 feet, and the storms would build up over these mountains. So there were thunderstorms that afternoon over these mountains. We got in there, and we were trying to get up, pick our way through, but we couldn't find a way, and got up higher and higher, and the plane didn't have oxygen in the system. Nobody had filled the oxygen system. And actually, I suffered from hypoxia. We got up about 18,000 feet, and there's only half the oxygen at 18,000 feet than you have at sea level. And it's kind of like a quick drunk. And first, of course, your vision gets affected, and your voice gets affected, your tongue gets about so big. And the flight commander had me in the right seat, and he was in the left seat, and he said, could see what was happening, and so he started down in the clouds going over these mountains, and it dawned on me that I could only see the one gauge, the rate of climb indicator, and it was pegged at 4,000 feet a minute going down, and it dawned on me that was going down too fast over those mountains. And so I tried to stop. I tried to slug him, and I couldn't. He was going down too fast, but we came out all right and got the load off. But boy, did I have a headache. The worst headache I ever had, because it really starved the brain of oxygen. And after that, even flying in the States, if I was going west over the Rockies, I always made sure there was some oxygen on the plane that I could suck on the hose if I wanted to. It's one of those I learned about flying from that type experience. Our base in Burma was in a valley, a town called Mishinau, and it was only 400 and some feet above sea level, but 15 miles east of the base we had 8,500-foot ridges, and it's a smaller one. So we had to watch our letdown pretty close, you know. We let down to the south where the valley was open. But those are the type of things we put up with going over the hump. And
You were able to get parts and everything, but when you did need them, were you supplied?
yeah, I said we had good maintenance on the airplanes. Of course, it was all done outdoors. There was no hangars at the bases because didn't know how long you're going to be there. Hopefully not too long.
What kind of conditions did you have at your bases in India? You mentioned you had paved runways, but what kind of quarters did you have?
Well, living conditions depended where we were. At Chittagong, India, we had fairly large bamboo buildings that one flight of about eight officers would share. And but then when we got over into Burma, we lived in tents, and there was no running water there. So, but we were right along the Irrawaddy River, so we used to bathe in the river and things. And but we were innovative, so the four of us whose tents joined, we got some P-38 wing tanks and cut the tops off and installed them between the four tents, so when it rained, the rainwater would run in there, which it did frequently. And so we came back from the mission, we'd have warm, soft water to take a quick shower in, which is better than the Irrawaddy River. But that's the way we were in those days. You did what you had to.
You mentioned hauling the troops. Did you have any contact with the Chinese or the Indians while you were, during your off time, and anything with the culture there that?
Not a lot. When we were at Chittagong, India, of course, that was a little more of a cosmopolitan area with a coastal town and things. And we did go off base there and go downtown, but I wouldn't say that you developed any friendships with any of them or anything. They did have workers, local indigenous workers in the dining room in the mess tent that we had. And of course that created another problem, because if we had pork, the Muslims wouldn't work, and if we had beef, the Hindus wouldn't work because of religious things. So they had to have two full crews, depending on what the menu was and which crew would work that day. So, yeah, there's little things like that come to mind when I think back on it. When you jiggle my memory a little bit, the food. Well, we always carried K rations in the airplane, and a lot of times that's what we had to subsist on. At the main base, we did have a mess tent or a mess hall where food was, at least it was hot. It wasn't always the best, but it was hot. And I don't know, I suppose we had Spam, but I don't remember all the menus. It wasn't so bad. But you accepted those things. You're young, and you figured, hey, this is the war, and this is the way you have to fight it. If you're stationed out in the boonies, you have to put up with some of these things. And our big problem was not getting our whiskey ration once a month that we're supposed to get. Sometimes it didn't come in frequently, but it's probably good for us anyway. And the C-46 was a good airplane, good engines, had a lot of power, and we had very little actual maintenance problem with the airplanes, considering the type of flying that we were doing. So that part of it was kind of reassuring. And I never had to shut down an engine on the hump. I did have one once that a couple of push rods broke, so we had a valve not operating, and it threw a lot of oil, but engine kept running all right. So as long as it's running, you keep it going. You don't shut it down unless you have to. But normally, and the C-46 did have a couple things that weren't the best. They had a courtesy electric propellers, which are not as reliable as the Hamilton Hydromatic, the oil type. But you had a manual control, so even if the governor stopped working, you could control it manually in most cases. And so that happened occasionally. And the plane also had a hydraulic boost system for the flight controls to make it easier to move them. And that was a plumber's nightmare. But if something happened, it went out, it really took a lot of manpower to handle the airplane in the air. But other than that, the airframe was good. Our 2800s were a very good engine. So that part of it worked pretty good. And after the war, of course, when the war ended, after they dropped the atomic weapons, we all thought, great, let's pack our bags and go home. But they told us, no, there's still people in China that need to eat and need the gas. So we had to keep flying over the hump. But I'll have to admit, we lost some interest. We didn't have the same initiative we'd had earlier. And we had one mission went up northeast. Well, Kunming in China, western China, was the point that we headed for. And from there, either we landed there or we branched out to other bases in China. And this one was up northeast of Kunming a ways. And we landed there about 10 o'clock at night. And so decided that we were tired, we needed crew rest. Didn't feel like heading back out over that rock pile that late. Well, the next morning at breakfast, this Army major came in and asked who was the aircraft commander. Of course, I admitted to it. And he asked why we didn't return the night before, how important it was to keep this flying going. Well, nothing he could do except turn in a report, because the aircraft commander has a responsibility for the crew and things. So, but that was the type of thing that happened. But it was a very interesting experience, I'll admit that. And then after the war, I did fly C-46s in the States for a while too, so I built up a lot of time in that big old airplane. It was the largest twin-engine airplane in World War II time period. And a lot of people compare it to the C-47, the DC-3 modification, you know. And the best way to describe it was the C-47's gross takeoff weight was 33,000 pounds, and I've flown C-46s as high as 54,000 pounds on gross takeoff weight. So it was a big difference in the two airplanes.
Those airplanes are still flying around the world, aren't they?
C-46s, there are some in Alaska and in northern Canada and Central and South America. They've modified them to some degree, and they don't have the same model we had. They don't have the propeller, and they've done away with the hydraulic boost system. They put counterbalance controls on the last model, so maintenance is much less on the ones they're flying now. Yeah, I'm amazed they're still hanging in there. Not as many as C-47s, though. There are more C-47s still flying.
I think it's amazing that you can still fly 60-year-old essentially designs.
Well, we had one of our C-47s in Vietnam, was built in 1942, and of course this was in the 70s, late 60s. And when you flew it, you could never trim the airplane up. You always had to fly it all the time. It wouldn't trim up to where it would fly. And the C-47 was a very stable airplane that normally would almost fly by itself. But they found out in inspection, we had them check it out, and they measured the length, and it was 1.25 inches longer than it was built, when it was built. So they looked at the flying wreck where it had been, and it had towed gliders in World War II at Sedalia, Missouri, in a glider school. And so towing all those gliders, I stretched the fuselage just a little bit. But it flew, but you always had to fly it. You couldn't take your hands off the controls.
Did you ever have to haul any livestock?
No, we didn't. C-47s did haul mules back over the hump, but we didn't in the C-46s, no.
Well, you were lucky then, because we've heard a couple of guys talk about doing that in C-47s, and they didn't particularly care for it.
No, the smell was bad, and they took the doors off, so then the wind blows in the back way from an airplane because of the vacuum it creates. And so you got all the smells up front. And then when the mission's over, you could never find the doors. Somebody had taken those off to put them on their house or their hovel someplace or something. So it was some funny actions over there. That, you know, I was glad we never did haul the mules.
It's funny because last week when it was Memorial Day, they were doing a lot of World War II movies, and they ran across one of the few movies I've ever seen. I think it was Mission to Burma.
Oh, with Errol Flynn.
Yeah, and it was on, and I watched a little bit of it, and I'm sure it was a very Hollywoodized version, but they had the sequence where they were supposedly behind enemy lines and they could radio or get contact, and the planes would look for them. Did you ever run into situations like that with people behind the scenes?
Well, we made drops like that where they would call us and give us their coordinates where they were approximately and things. And one thing about that movie, Objective Burma, I remember one of the shots, there was I think it was a C-47 taking off, but then it showed an aerial shot and it was a C-46 in the air at a distance. So that was Hollywood, the stock film, I guess they had. Of course, somebody that had been there familiar would recognize that. A lot of people wouldn't make any difference to them.
I know enough about Hollywood to know that when they're making a war movie, you have to take it with a grain of salt until you can kind of research it. And yeah, they're not always very accurate with things like that. So I was kind of wondering if that was a movie you were familiar with, and if there were things there that were just blatantly wrong.
Well, I've seen it a few times, and it still plays on TV every once in a while.
They bring it around for Memorial Day, Veterans Day, when they do the marathons and things like that. But I didn't know if you had missions that were similar to what they portrayed there.
That's interesting because a lot of that was just for the people here. It was propaganda, just to pump people up.
That's right. Sell bonds, sell war bonds. Yeah. Well, they had that great comic strip too, Steve Canyon, and that was accurate. And Milt Caniff, who wrote that, he had a buddy, a colonel, and it was in CBI, and he used to get information from him. And that was accurate, and his drawings were good, so we had to follow Terry and the Pirates, of course. That was
How long were you there?
I was there about 21 months.
That's an awful lot of flying in 21 months, isn't it?
Yeah. Well, we did fly a lot. The only 1 month I really remember was that after the war ended and we still had to fly, I logged 117 hours flying in the month of September over the hump from even after the war ended. So they kept us flying.
Now, you went on to Korea, too. You stayed in the...
Yes, I'm retired Air Force. I stayed on. In Korea, though, I was stationed in Japan, and we were flying supplies and support from Japan back and forth to Korea. So it wasn't like being right in where they might shell us at night or anything like that.
What kind of aircraft?
In those days, good old C-47, the DC-3 type. And in fact, that's what I ended up flying in Vietnam, was the DC-3 type, Well, in Vietnam, the Air Force gathered airplanes from all over. Anything that was flyable ended up with some kind of a mission in Vietnam. And I was in a unit that we had an electronic surveillance mission. We had 3 security service positions in the back of the plane that were monitoring the Viet Cong radio transmissions for intelligence purposes. So we'd just go up and fly around for about 7 hours in certain sectors, and then that was it. And we stayed just high enough to stay out of the ground fires. So really, for us old men, it was not a bad mission at all. And it was good to get into a familiar airplane because I hadn't had a flying assignment the one before Vietnam. And rather than put me in something new that I didn't know anything about.
Were you based at a base in Vietnam, or do you fly in from somewhere else?
No, we were at Nha Trang in Vietnam. The base we were at was Nha Trang, which had been a French resort town years ago when the French controlled Vietnam. So there was a nice coastal area, nice beach along there, and some nice homes in that area. It was a different war.
How long were you over there?
That was just a 1-year assignment. And I really couldn't get interested in that war as much as earlier one. Well, I don't like to fight a war that you're not fighting to win.
We've had several people had the same sentiment.
Oh yes, quite a few. But you worked hard. I worked hard, and I was an instructor pilot and flight test maintenance and things, and so I flew a lot. I logged over 1,000 hours in the 10.5 months or so that I was active flying in Vietnam, so I kept busy. That was the best thing to do.
You mentioned you were flying electronic surveillance. What kind of, what all did that entail, those kind of missions?
What was the first part of that?
Talking about you flew in Vietnam, you mentioned that flying electronic
Oh,
surveillance.
yeah.
What all did that entail?
Well, it said we had these security service personnel with 3 positions with their consoles in the cargo area of the airplane, and they monitored the thing. This was a classified mission at that time, and now they have C-130s that do the same thing, much more sophisticated. They even have language specialists in the airplane that interpret as they're collecting the information, so they can relate immediately to the active forces. But in our case, they just recorded it all and took it back and turned it over to the intelligence section. So, and we'd pick up strengths, number of losses and things overnight, so it was a positive mission that way.
How long were you in?
In the Air Force, about 31 years total time.
You were one of the few guys we've talked to that actually went in, wanted to be a pilot, became a pilot right away, and stayed with it.
Well, it was, yeah, and most of my flying was with transport and cargo type airplanes, so I like to kind of categorize my career as part airline pilot, part FedEx pilot, but with much more antiquated equipment and a lot less money. But that's a good. We had 3 years in Oslo, Norway, with a NATO assignment, and 3 years. And well, I was in Japan 3 years during the Korean War, and the family was there 2.5 years with us. So it was a very interesting tour in life, because we did get to learn a lot of things and see different parts of the world. Of course, then I'd get things like a year in Vietnam, a year in remote Alaska, and a radar site, and things like this where the family couldn't join you. But, a lot of commercial people have the same kind of problems too, so it all worked out fine. Well, I appreciate the opportunity, because like you said, there has not been that much activity or information and news getting out on World War II especially, and different things going on. But,
we're hoping to get to a show in the next couple of years that will be on Flying the Hump. That we can run on Rocky Mountain PBS statewide here. Yeah. Because you're right, people don't hear about it, they don't know about it, and they should.
Well, I hope I'm still around. I'm 87 now,
Oh, you're a youngster.
But you're doing awfully good.
Well, I'm happy. I've had a bypass surgery. Never had a heart attack, but I've had bypass surgery, and I've got a pacemaker and some of these things. But I'm pleased with my health for the age that I'm at, especially compared to some of the people that are in the retirement home that I'm living with that are younger than I am.
That's great.
But I try to stay active. I volunteer at the Air Museum and things.
It brings up the question here is that we've interviewed several people and have talked, and we have some basic knowledge of it. If somebody asked you what you did during the war, are they even aware of what happened in the CBI?
Not really, no, because the China-Burma Theater got almost no publicity back here. England had most of the correspondence where they could sit in a bar in London and file our stories, but we didn't have many in China, Burma, India. And of course South Pacific had more also, especially after the European campaign wound down. But No, there are a lot of people that still don't even know. They see my cap and they say, "Do we have people in China, Burma, India?" You know, it really and that's why I wear this cap. I don't wear I volunteer at the Wings Over the Rockies Air Museum, but because this hat stimulates conversation and questions with some of the people and bring it up. So, and they like to hear the stories.
So they're pretty surprised when they find out what kind of things you guys were doing there.
Yes, they were. They do get surprised, and the amount of activity we had over there, and you know, we had P-38s and P-51s. The British had some fighter planes over there, and other planes. So there was a fair amount of flying activity going on, especially during the Burma side part of the campaign. Because after that, the fighters didn't have much to do after the Burma campaign folded. There wasn't any activity over the hump, so we didn't need any escorts, which we never had anyway. But
You kept track of other guys that flew the hump if you had reunions?
well, in our squadron, I'm still in contact with about five people that maintain contact with, but so many of us have passed on now. In fact, the official Hump Pilots Association has disbanded because of the lack of people. Years ago, we used to get 1,500 people, including wives, to the annual reunions, and the last one we had barely 400 people. So it disbanded. There's a group of China, Burma, India pilots that still kind of get together, but it's an informal operation now.
Do you attend those?
No, I haven't gotten involved with that. Other people that I know from my squadron they're not interested either, so I don't go to those. Some of them are not physically capable, you know, of doing these things.
Are there other guys here in the Denver area? Or do you have other guys from your unit?
No, nobody from the Denver area, no.